I'd like to open this session and welcome you to this afternoon's NTW platform. And today I want to introduce Dr. Indira Natarajan, who will be discussing the use of the Geko device, a neuromuscular electrostimulation device for the prevention of venous thromboembolism in patients with acute stroke. This session is being recorded and so later will be added to the NTW22 platform if you'd like to rewatch or signpost colleagues to it. Now, Dr. Indira Natarajan is a consultant stroke physician. Since his appointment as consultant physician in 2008, Dr. Indira has held various leadership positions within stroke care, both regionally and nationally. He's always been a champion ambassador for stroke victims with roles in Midlands Stroke Clinical Network and the University Hospital of North Midlands NHS Trust. He has raised the profile of services in all aspects of care, from stroke prevention to end-of-life support for stroke patients in the community, and is widely known for his innovative work. Dr. Indira has pioneered innovations in the area of interface, working for stroke prevention in patients with arterial fibrillation, and the introduction of Sky Medical's technology Geko device as an adjunct to current VT prevention guidelines, which has benefited many stroke patients. He and his team have won a number of awards for innovation in stroke practice, including Health and Social Awards for Stroke Services and the Healthcare Pioneers Award, showcasing best practice in AF, presented by the AF Association. So without further ado, I will pass over to Dr. Indira and I will share the screen.
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everybody. And as Joe introduced, I am a clinician in Stoke-on-Trent. And we are a comprehensive stroke unit, seeing around 1,200 strokes every year. So we are a tertiary neurosciences center for thrombectomy and neurosurgical emergencies. Next slide, please. I mean, the background was when we got first introduced to the Geko device, we were already aligned to the UK NICE guidance of standard of care using IPC, aspirin and intravenous fluids for the prevention of VTE. And this was a time when CLOTS-3 trial was published, where it clearly demonstrated that IPC had a good RCT evidence for stroke prevention, for VTE prevention in post-stroke patients. The CLOTS-3 study showed that there was a 30% non-compliance to IPC. So that means a big chunk of population were exposed to VTE complications post-stroke. And if you do not have any sort of VTE prevention mechanisms, the CLOTS-3 said there was an 8.7% VTE risk where there was no VTE prophylaxis prescribed. So at this stage, we had a discussion with the team from the Geko, and we thought that was there a possibility of a project that we would do to see whether the 30% was in the real world as well, and also to explore our unmet need and determine the Geko device as an alternative anti-stasis intervention as part of our care pathway. So when we devised the project, we thought we will assess all the patients that coming through our doors having VTE prophylaxis and assess what was the VTE events at 90 days post-stroke. Next slide, please. So just a brief introduction about the Geko device. It's a neuromuscular electrical stimulation device, as already been mentioned. It's the size of a wristwatch, and you can see that on your screen. Next slide, please. And this device is worn at the knee, and the device is at the outer end of the fibular head. The purpose is to stimulate the common peroneal nerve and the foot muscles, resulting in increased blood flow in the deep veins of the calf. That's equating to around 60% of walking without the patient having to move. Next slide, please. So that's sort of the labeled parts of the Geko device. You've got a positive and a negative sign to two switches adjusting the stimulation levels. It's got 11 stimulation levels, and the LED flashes to indicate the stimulation levels as well. Basically, the adjustments is to show that whether the device is stimulating the peroneal nerve by looking at the foot muscles and the foot. So it has to both move. That indicates that the device is very active and you're getting sequential compression preventing stasis. Next slide. That's the gel or adhesive gel, so that it just makes the circuit along the head of the fibula. Next slide. So the regulatory approval for the Geko was mainly to prevent venous thrombosis, increased circulation in the deeper muscles of the calf, and prevention and treatment of edema. Next slide. So basically, just a couple of key areas. I'm sure because it's a thrombosis committee, we all know what is a VT burden. And I'll just touch how it has an impact in stroke and the current stroke prophylaxis. We are all aware that VT kills one person every 37 seconds in the Western world, 840,000 deaths annually, 25,000 people die each year in UK from VTE. Hospital-acquired DVT and VT can exist in any care pathway and affect any patients throughout their journey when they are in hospital. Right. Next slide. We already know that the cause for thrombosis are threefold: stasis, hypercoagulability, and vessel wall injury. In post-stroke, the two main complications are stasis, because when you are paralyzed, you're not able to move that particular part of the limb. And post-stroke, you possibly lost your swallow, you're not drinking enough, you're not having adequate nutrition, so your blood is hypercoagulable. And so these two major mechanisms cause increased VT incidence in post-stroke patients. Next slide. Right, so until CLOTS 3 came, the CLOTS 2 trial clearly said that graduated anti-embolic stockings were no use, whether it was below the knee or above knee. So once CLOTS 2 came out, overnight, across all the stroke units in England, we stopped using anti-embolic stockings. Then the CLOTS 3 published, and that clearly showed that the intermittent pneumatic compression devices had a good evidence of significantly reducing the incidence of VT post-stroke. But that study also showed that there was a non-compliance to around greater than 30% of stroke patients. And the drug use in post-stroke, immediate post-stroke, is not indicated as per the RCT, so as per the UK and NICE guidelines, RCP and UK NICE guidelines. Next slide. So the NICE guidance MTG said that Geko can be used for people who are high risk of VTE, for whom pharmacological or other mechanical methods of VT preventions are impractical or contraindicated. So basically, the Geko came into the place where it was approved for unmet needs. When we say unmet needs, that's the 30% of population who can't tolerate standard of care apart from IV fluids, aspirin, hydration, and IPC. It is not a displacement, because we would need an RCT to displace the standard of care, and an RCT is underway. Next slide. So IPC, what are the problems with IPC? IPC can't be used in patients who've got a significant neuropathy, fragile skin, open wounds, arterial disease, if they're allergic to the current products, cardiac failure, and leg edema. And the other problems with the practical problems are, if you've seen IPCs used in hospitals, you know that it's a huge sort of a sleeve that's wrapped around your legs. It looks like as if you're ready for going for a cricket match. You like wearing pads all the time at night. And it is a deterrent for physios when patients are seen by physios and occupational therapists. They are attached to a pump. It takes a lot of time to take it away and then to engage them in therapy. And another thing that I was amazed to watch was when you go for the morning ward rounds, a lot of these IPCs on the floor, because the patients have moved the IPCs it's on the ground rather than onto the patient. Unlike drugs, when you give a drug, you know that the drug is in the system for the 24 hours. But with IPC or any sort of mechanical device, we need to make sure that it is adherent to the patient for 24 hours to be measuring it as effective. Next slide. So what is drug pharmacological prophylaxis contraindicated? Because in acute hyperacute stroke, we do not use low molecular weight heparin because there are other problems: elevated blood pressure, decreased platelets. An acute stroke by itself, whether it's an ischemic stroke or a hemorrhagic stroke, if it's an ischemic stroke, we are very worried about hemorrhagic conversion. And if it's an hemorrhagic stroke, we worry about the volume expansion of the blood. So in terms of the next slide, in terms of health economics, I always say that I'm a clinician and I do not know much about health economics, but they've said it's been cost neutral across 15 days when no other DVT prophylaxis can be prescribed. And it's cost neutral across 3 days if in combination with chemical prophylaxis, that is drugs. Next slide. So from now on, I'm going to show our experience with the Geko device in the Royal Stoke unit, a stroke unit. Next slide. So as I said, the types of stroke included in the study, that any stroke that comes through the door, whether it's an ischemic stroke or a hemorrhagic stroke, they were taken part in the study so that we didn't have any sort of a bias when we looked at the patients. We looked at both intracerebral and subarach, although the subarach patients after initial assessment go under the neurosurgeons. Next slide. Right, so as we know that once you're stroked, you have temporary or permanent loss of limb movement, you've got prolonged immobility, you have loss of calf muscle activation and function, increased risk of stasis, and hypercoagulatory state as well. So the Geko device naturally was to aim a muscle pump activation and anti-stasis blood flow enhancement in the deep veins of the calf. So that's where the role of Geko came in. So this is a slide that we took from the CLOTS-3 study. And if you see on the left-hand side corner, the VT incidence with standard of care without IPC, that is just IV fluids, aspirin, and good nursing care, the VT incidence was 8.7%. But by using IPC, that was reduced to 6.6%. So basically, there was a 30% issue of compliance with IPC. So that means that is where we thought, what would be the role of the Geko? Next slide. So this is a slide just to show that why low molecular weight heparin is not used in the first week post hyperacute stroke, whether it's an ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke. The risk of symptomatic intracranial hemorrhage outweighs the benefit of VT prevention with routine anticoagulation. That's why, in our center, we don't routinely use the low molecular weight heparin as a part of VT. Next one. So our findings. Next. So we enrolled 1,000 plus patients, and we completed the data set of 1,383 patients. And our real world data matched with what we found on CLOT-3 study, because that showed that 29.5% of patients required mechanical intervention were contraindicated or they couldn't tolerate IPC. And that was a significant unmet need. And when we looked at the VT incidence at 90 days post-stroke, after we changed our practice with the use of IPC plus Geko, which showed that we had 11 VTs in patients prescribed on IPC alone. We didn't have any VTs in patients on the Geko arm. So the Geko was worn on both legs for 24 hours a day. And the average time they worn was between 5 and 9 days. And the maximum time was up to 30 days. Once they reached the 30 days, we removed the Geko, or if they were discharged earlier to home, we removed the device. Next slide, please. So this is a sort of a pie chart to show how was the split. So you can just see 463 patients had IPC on its own, 122 patients had a Geko. And 81 of them were on IPC to start with, and then they were changed onto Geko because they couldn't tolerate the IPC. So we could just see that out of 463 had IPC, around 200 of the patients had Geko in some shape or form. 125 patients had to be used for drug prophylaxis, 22 refused prophylaxis, and 187 patients did not need any sort of mechanical prophylaxis because they were deemed, ambulant. And they had a minor non-disabling stroke where they needed no VT prophylaxis at all. The next slide, please. This shows that what is the, of all the patients, the unmet need was around 30% because they were intolerant to the IPC, 11%, and the contraindications were around 17%. So that added up to around 30% that needed an alternative to IPC. Next slide. So this shows that the Geko device was tolerated around 91% compared to the IPC around 78.2%. We didn't have any sort of major problems apart from some sort of contact dermatitis in a small group of patients. The next slide is just a histogram just to show that on IPC alone, the total number of VT events was 11. And on the Geko alone arm, there wasn't any VT at all. So the next slide is, please. This basically was our major conclusion that our data suggested that the device was safe and as effective as IPC. And in the absence of an RCT, the results of this audit support that Geko as a meaningful addition to our prophylactic options for stroke patients at a high risk of VTE who have contraindications to IPC. And I want to just emphasize, if you want to displace IPC, we really need to have a head-to-head RCT. And at present, we are on the process of doing an RCT, but at present, still the standard of care is aspirin fluids, IPC. And again, that 30% of the population is where we are targeted the Geko device. Next slide. So basically, this brought about a significant change in nursing clinical practice. It also changed the way we looked at mechanical devices. We increased surveillance because, as I said, IPC and Geko are not drugs, so we need to make sure it's adherent to the patient throughout the 24-hour period. So every shift had a sort of a person assigned to go around to make sure that these are adhered to the patient, to make sure they are effective. And our real world data influence other UK stroke units to adopt the Geko device, and the Luton and Dunstable down south were the first to come and start. And now I've heard that there are lots of units that are adopting the use of Geko for the unmet need. And all the centers have consistently shown their level of unmet need matches the CLOTS 3 and the Royal Stroke findings. Next slide. Before we had to put the project, we had to go through a lot of barriers, make sure that it's right for the patient. Patient safety is of paramount. So we had patient groups. We made sure that all the patients had the current VTE prophylaxis as per standard of care. We needed to make sure the device was safe, and we had to go through quality checks and governance. And through the governance route, we also embedded this in our practice with changes in the drug chart. So we had to interact with a lot of other stakeholders. Next slide. As I said, all the stakeholders were engaged, and it was just not putting the practice in by using the Geko. We needed to have a good, robust data collection. We needed to make sure that we studied all the VTE at the end of 6 weeks and 3 months. And as I mentioned, it is part of the pharmacy helped us to put this on the drug chart. So when you prescribe VTE prophylaxis, we need to make sure whether it was IPC or Geko or low molecular weight heparin. And we devised our own database. We had a lot of help from GNM and Sky to analyze the data. And participant patients received regular follow-ups once they left the unit. And we also had a lot of all the staff in the ward trained. We also identified champions so that everybody in the ward were comfortable in using the device. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that just shows, when you are in a process of innovation or when you want to bring in change, it's going to be difficult. Change in any shape or form is not very useful used in human mankind, because we're all comfortable with what we are doing. But when we want to, when you want to introduce change, you need to look why we need to introduce change. And here we had a challenge because we knew that there was a 8.7% risk of VT when no prophylaxis, and we couldn't give a low molecular weight heparin because it was not recommended, and the guidelines and the RCT showed that there was increased risk of intracerebral hemorrhages. We had evidence that pumps were effective, but again, it was only tolerated, and there was a 30% patients who couldn't manage with the pumps. So we identified that we can't just isolate and leave these patients without any sort of intervention. So then we had a neuromuscular device which was scientifically proven, which was the a nice approved Geko device. So we thought, why can't we just try it in this cohort of post-stroke patients who are high risk of VTE? So we had to go through our governance arm, make sure that we are doing the right things. We had to collect ongoing data, and we submitted the data to all the forums. And our real-world data showed that that the 30% can also have an alternative VT prophylaxis, which reduces the 8.7% stroke VT burden. And this clearly showed that the Geko was as effective as IPC in our study. And now other hospitals across the UK and probably internationally are slowly adopting this practice. And these are, at the end of the day, benefiting patients, and that's all why we are all here about. Supporting evidence, I think we published this poster in international conferences. What exactly the data which I've shown you has been submitted an abstract, and the same sort of data was collected by the Luton and Dunstable team, and they have published the data in international conferences. And more or less the experience across all the hospitals which have adopted the use of Geko has shown what we experience in our hospital. and our experience matches with the CLOTS-3 trial, showing that there is a big group of patients who can't just tolerate what is the current standard of care. So we have another intervention up our sleeve in this high-risk vulnerable group of patients who are at risk of VTE post-stroke. Thanks for listening, and I hope that has been useful and provocating your thought in probably changing, the practice in your current units on top of your standard of care.
From the question and answer bar first, though, somebody wondered if there was, they've really enjoyed your talk, is there any comparison study between Geko device and low molecular weight heparin?
No, there isn't any head-to-head with Geko and low molecular weight heparin. And the use of low molecular weight heparin varies across the units in England. There are some units that doesn't use during their hyperacute phase, but there are some units, once they deem that the patient have gone past the hyperacute phase, they use low molecular weight heparin along with IPC, but that's not a standard of care that we use, and there isn't any RCT comparing Geko to low molecular weight heparin.
Okay, and then some questions here really about the practical use of it. So is the Geko device waterproof, or does it need to be removed when taking a shower or bath?
Yeah, I mean, it is not waterproof, and that is why, when you have any sort of, if a patient has gone for a shower, you take the device off, make sure that it's wiped and clean dry before the device is reapplied. So even not only waterproof, if you have any sort of spillage of bodily fluids, blood or urine or any sort of bodily fluids, it has to be wiped. The area should be completely wiped dry, and then the device attached.
Thank you. How about when patients are undergoing physio or mobilization? Are they able to keep it on then, and will they sleep as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, that's one big area where it was very useful, because unlike the IPC, the patients carry on physio, OT, whatever their needs. There are two options: either the device can be completely switched off, or it can be even kept switched on while they are, undergoing therapy. It is not a barrier at all.
Okay, some more questions before I take any more of the pre-submitted ones about. But they're presuming they're battery operated. Is this rechargeable, or do they come in pairs for practical use?
No, the device, each device has got a battery life of 30 hours. So basically, the purpose of the device and the recommendations are you dispose of after the use for 24 hours. So every morning they need a pair of new device. So the old pair is disposed and a new pair applied, but it can't be used more than 30 hours. The battery life is only 30 hours.
Is it, if it's being refitted on a regular basis, sort of every 2 or so days, is it quite easy to fit, or is there
it's
required?
No, it needs training, because it's anything, just like any new device. There is a marker on the device to show where it should sit on the fibula head. And what we recommend is, once the device is fit, we just use a marker pen just to mark it on the patient's leg, so that when you fit it on the next day, you don't need to search for the location. You just exactly fit it into that place. And once there are, as I said, there are 11 sort of adjustment modes. And what you need to see is, when you apply the device, gradually play around with the plus and the minus to make sure that the calf muscles and the foot is moving. That indicates that the purpose of the device is established. But it's quite easy, and there are training organized by GNN. It's a 45-minute RCN approved training along with videos. So it's quite easy to train, and all our HCAs and nurses are trained. They were trained within 2 weeks.
Brilliant, thank you. That actually was one of the questions, because that's really helpful for the practical implications and training of staff. So thank you. So a short training course, and it easily
it's only 45 minutes, easily accessible. It's not a major issue.
In the data that you shared, there was only one patient who had refused any prophylaxis. In general,
no, there were 22 patients. I think.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. But in general, is this device well tolerated and accepted by patients in your experience?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Even before we went in to put on the patients, we tried it onto ourselves. And I mean, when you initially start, it is a slight. So it's not like you're without anything. It just provocates, and you get just sort of gentle movements in your leg. But with regards to patients who have stroke, they've had a major brain insult, So there are lots of neurocognitive issues and, the brain rewiring, remodeling happening. So at that time, even with IPCs or with the Geko, there has been never an issue with tolerance. So, when we did a sort of a survey, patient survey on tolerability, I was mainly concerned whether this would prevent them from sleeping, or, that was my main sort of issue, but nobody ever mentioned. And once they understood the purpose of the device, there wasn't any issues with tolerability.
Thank you. And in general, is that true also of any skin irritation? Because obviously there is the gel and the device itself.
Yeah, I mean, some patients did develop contact dermatitis, or some people had bony prominences where the device was not. So we slightly changed, or if the dermatitis was very bad, obviously, they can't. But that was a very small handful of patients, not a huge group.
Okay, thank you. Well, somebody's mentioned that obviously there is a machine, the TENS machine, which sends electrical pulses. How is the Geko different? And is there different reasons, different purposes for them?
Yeah, TENS is also a stimulation device, but the purpose of the TENS is mainly to prevent pain signals going into the brain as a counter irritant. But this is a completely different mechanism where it stimulates the common peroneal nerve to pump blood along the veins to prevent, and also to prevent stasis. So although it looks very similar, but they have different purposes in terms of the reason why it's used.
Thank you. Have you found it, and this is a question from one of the audience, particularly better in any groups of patients, so this person's asked, maybe in post-surgical orthopedic patients, than other options, or
I mean, I don't see why it can't be used in other areas, and our intensive care unit have adopted our practice, and I've also been had the benefit of listening to other talks where there was an obstetrician called Dr. Fauzi who was used it in unstable and unstable on patients who had after post pregnancy. Where there is a big contraindication for standard prophylaxis, and that sort of has been adopted in University Hospital of Birmingham as well in their maternity unit. So there are other areas outside stroke where this device is being incorporated in practice. But as I said in our statement, VTE is a major burden in any hospitalized patients. So I think as the evidence grows and we know that it's safe, and we have another device in our armory. And if I was a clinician looking after these patients, I would probably try it on them.
Okay, thank you. And somebody's asked, could you just go through, so in IPC displacement, the difference between the two and the current guidance? So if they were making a decision, how could they be guided, please?
Right, so the basic thing is standard of care is aspirin, intravenous fluids, IPC. As I said, that there are patients who can't have IPC because of, if they have arterial disease, if they've got ulcers, if they've got lymphedema, they had peripheral pitting edema. Those are the group where you can't apply IPC. So that is a group of patients where we said, right, we could have done IPC on this patient. This patient is contraindicated, so we use the Geko. Or some patients, we use IPC, but they're not able to keep the IPC on. They're saying that, it's discomfort, it's sweaty, I can't sleep. So then we initially offer the IPC and then switch them on to Geko. And that is where I said that 81 patients in our group had the IPC and then they couldn't tolerate it. And then we change them to Geko.
Brilliant, thank you. Similarly, what are the contraindications when not to use it?
I mean, the contraindications are the major contraindications are is if as soon as it's a patient choice. So if they're putting and the patients are saying, 22 of our patients denied any sort of intervention. It is just that some group of patients will not tolerate any sort of mechanical intervention at all. They just don't like anything fitted to them. So that's a group of patients. Apart from them, there isn't any contraindications like what the IPC have. Because if you had an ulcer in your leg or a lymphedema or a pedal edema, you're only using the device on the femur, on the fibula head. So the same contraindication for high PC doesn't fit with the Geko.
Okay, and would it be safe in patients who may have mechanical heart valves or cardiac defibrillators or anything like that fitted?
Yeah, we don't have any problems. The only thing that what we need to be aware is when they're doing a standard 12 lead ECG with a Geko, because it's a nerve electrical stimulation device, the ECG will show some complexes suggestive of look like a pace complex. So you need to switch off the machine when you're taking an ECG. But apart from that, we didn't have any problems when they had any sort of implantable devices inside them. There was no contraindication.
Thank you. The device, I understand, has different levels of stimulation. How do you decide which is the correct level?
Right, as I said, well, once you apply the device, and the way we recognize that the device is doing its job is looking for movement of the calf muscles and the foot muscles moving. Until we achieve that, we just go with the plus sign, or if the jerky movements are too much, then we just make sure that we go for the negative sign, so that we just make sure that it is comfortable for the patient, but at the same time, the calf muscles and the toes are moving. So that indicates that the purpose of the device is established.
Great. So that's really patient, very individual, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
And we have one last question about the disposal. Obviously, if a patient was to use these over a number of days, you would soon gather quite a few. So how can these be reused or sent back, or how are they best disposed of?
No. As I said, its life of Geko is only 20. The manufacturer advice is only 24 hours. All the battery life is 30 hours. That's just mainly to just give that extra time when patients are washed or changed in a routine ward. It just gives you that extra flexibility of giving the staff that changing period, but you can't use it more than 30 hours. So it has to be disposed every morning on your ward round. And there are different NHS, every organization has a mechanism in which to dispose this. In our organization, what we do is, so we just cut the two ends of the sleeve, and the battery part is disposed in a battery disposable. You can actually also remove the battery and dispose the device. In some organizations, they do that, but every organization has a framework of how safely to dispose the device. So we just need to see what is the practice in each of your organizations.
And finally, if anybody wanted to contact you for further information or guidance, are you happy to be contacted?
Yeah, we would be delighted. And we've already invited many other stroke units to come and see our practice. And Swindon was one of the Luton and Dunstable, one of the first units who came and had a look at how we did it. And so we are happy to share. I mean, NHS is all about sharing good practice. So we are more than welcome to invite anybody who wants to come and see that.
Okay. Thank you, Indira. I think we had lots of questions. I think we've exhausted virtually all of them now. So thank you so much. That was really interesting. And to remind everybody that a recording of this will be available shortly on the NTW22 platform. But for now, thank you very much, Indira. Thank you, Sky Medical, for your sponsorship of this symposium, and to everybody who's joined. Thank you.